Today we are looking at a case from the mid-18th century, so sit back as we go to England. Laurance Shirley, the 4th Earl Ferrers, came from a family of antiquity and honour. The actual family name was Shirley and dated back to the time of William the Conqueror, the first Norman King of England. The first Lord Ferrers was Sir Robert Shirley, who was given the title in 1711. Laurance was born on the 18th of August 1720. He was the eldest son of the Honourable Laurance Ferrers, who himself was the youngest son of the first Earl Ferrers, Robert Shirley. The family lineage can be traced back to Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex, an English nobleman in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, who in 1593 was made a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council. However, in 1599, Robert Devereux was placed under house arrest following a poor campaign in Ireland during the 9 Years' War, and then led a failed attempt to overthrow Her Majesty's government. He was later tried and found guilty of treason. He was executed on the 25th of February 1601. At the time of Laurance's birth, England had a population of just over 5 million people, of which it was estimated that around 700,000 lived in London. The population was growing rapidly, and London was becoming a dirty, noisy and overcrowded place. Although life was often very difficult for the poor, this was not the case for the upper class, a small minority of the population, many who lived a luxurious and lavish lifestyle, often with houses in both the city and the country, usually filled with the finest furniture. An even smaller group was the aristocracy, an immensely wealthy elite that in the mid-18th century comprised of around 150 families, who between them owned around 1/5 of all the land in the country. These families would farm some of the land themselves, but they also leased a lot to tenant farmers and charged them rent. Laurance Shirley was part of the aristocracy, something that seemed to suit him very well. He was educated in the best schools and then went on to study at Oxford University, but he liked to drink and gamble, and when he was 20 years old, he left his studies, left the city of Oxford, and in fact, left the country. He went to live in Paris, where he continued to conduct himself in quite an extravagant manner. It was said that when under the influence of alcohol, he acted with all the wildness and brutality of a madman. In 1745, Laurance inherited the title of Earl Ferrers from his uncle, the 3rd Earl Ferrers. His uncle had in fact been removed from the office in 1742, as he was considered to be insane, but he was not replaced until his death 3 years later. Laurance's title brought with it great wealth. This included large estates in the counties of Leicestershire, Derbyshire and Northamptonshire. He decided to reside in Staunton Harold Hall, a very large and elegant property in northwest Leicestershire. Despite his title, wealth and responsibilities, Laurance's behaviour did not improve. From 1743, he had been conducting a relationship with a lady named Mrs. Margaret Clifford, and by 1749, she had given birth to 4 illegitimate daughters. But of course, Laurance had no plans to marry Mrs. Clifford. Instead, he would marry someone of a far higher social standing. In 1752, he married Mary Meredith, a 16-year-old noble lady, who was the youngest daughter of Sir Amos Meredith of Henbury in Cheshire, and his wife, the former Miss Joanna Cholmondeley. Mary's brother William was a Member of Parliament and had become the 3rd Baronet Meredith in the same year that Mary and Laurance were married. Mary was now known as Countess Ferrers. The marriage was not a happy one. Mary was always mindful not to antagonise her husband, even though he often behaved in a very cruel manner towards her. She was aware that the Ferrers family had a history of strange and eccentric behaviour, and Laurance, the 4th Earl Ferrers, was no different. He had a violent temper, especially after he had been drinking. He was also still conducting his relationship with Mrs. Margaret Clifford, the mother of his 4 illegitimate daughters. However, despite his outbursts and his mood swings, he was very capable of managing his business affairs and looked after his estates. Eventually, Mary decided that she could no longer put up with his irrational and brutish manner and returned to live in the home of her parents. In the 1750s, this was most unusual, but Countess Ferrers thought that she had no choice in the matter. She was regarded as a lady who was quite remarkable for her patience and mild disposition, and during her 6 years of marriage, people had often commented on her tolerant and charming nature. The Countess applied to Parliament for redress, and subsequently an act was passed, which meant that she would be able to receive a maintenance payment from her husband's estates. This would be by the way of a separate trust, which would be administered by a trustee appointed by the courts. The unfortunate gentleman who was given the position of trustee was Mr. John Johnson. He had been brought up on the Ferrers estates and was held in high regard for the regular manner in which he kept his accounts. He was also known to be a very honest and honourable gentleman. Despite the fact that he was considered to be the best person to act as trustee, Mr. Johnson did not want to accept the position. He was only too aware of what a difficult man Earl Ferrers could be, and he was sure that following Parliament's decision to award a monthly maintenance payment to the Countess, the Earl would become even more unbearable. So Mr. Johnson declined their request. Eventually, however, after much persuasion, he agreed that he would act as trustee. Mr. Johnson lived in a house that belonged to the Earl's estate in North Leicestershire. It was only about half a mile from Staunton Harold Hall. He would now collect the rents from the tenant farmers before going to speak to the Earl. He would then settle the accounts, which were now placed under his care. At first the arrangement worked, but as the months passed, the Earl started to very much distrust Mr. Johnson. He believed that Mr. Johnson and the other trustees had prevented him from receiving a lucrative coal contract, and the Earl was also very displeased when he learnt that Mr. Johnson had paid the Countess £50 without his consent, even though Mr. Johnson did not need the approval of the Earl to pay his estranged wife the money that the law required that he pay her. The Earl started to get more and more concerned about Mr. Johnson. He started to speak to him in a very derogatory manner. He told him that he was a villain who was conspiring with people who do not favour him to do him harm. The Earl eventually told him that he must move from the house on the estates and could no longer farm on his land. However, unbeknown to Earl Ferrers, he was unable to demand this, as the Act of Separation had stated that Mr. Johnson was a trustee appointed by the courts, and he had the right to continue to live in the house and farm the land. This only upset the Earl even more. The Earl's household consisted of Mrs. Clifford, along with her 4 daughters who had been fathered by him. There were also 5 male servants, a kitchen boy, and 3 maids. On Wednesday, the 18th of January 1760, Mr. Johnson called at Staunton Harold Hall. An appointment had been arranged with the Earl to go through the estate's accounts. At the same time, Mrs. Clifford and her daughters were just going out for a walk. The male servants had all been sent on errands, so this meant that only the 3 maids were left in the house. One of them, named Elizabeth Burgeland, answered the door to Mr. Johnson, and a few minutes later escorted him to the Earl's apartments. As Mr. Johnson entered, the Earl got out of his chair and bolted the door. A rather strange thing to do, but Mr. Johnson had become accustomed to the Earl's erratic behaviour. The Earl then asked Mr. Johnson to settle his accounts. By now he was becoming quite abrasive. He told Mr. Johnson that he was a villain and demanded that he kneel down in front of him. The Earl was speaking in such a raised voice that the maids were able to hear every word. He then said, "Down on your knee. Declare that you have acted against Lord Ferrers. Your time is come. You must die." Earl Ferrers then drew a pistol from his pocket and shot Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson fell backwards, but then stood up and declared that he was a trustee and the Earl must desist from any further violence against him. Earl Ferrers looked at him and calmly unbolted the door and walked out of the room. The maids rushed in. They had heard the shot and were most concerned. One immediately went to fetch the surgeon, a gentleman named Dr. Kirkland. Mr. Johnson was put in bed and treated by the doctor. Mr. Johnson's daughter, named Sarah, was also sent for. The Earl spoke to her, and although not at all remorseful, he told her that if her father died, he would take care of their family, provided, of course, that they did not prosecute him. He spent the next few hours drinking, eventually falling asleep. Mr. Johnson was then taken back to his house. However, his condition did not improve, and the next day, he died. With news of the death of such a popular and well-respected gentleman, local people made their way to Staunton Harold Hall to confront the Earl, but he would not come out and instead locked the doors and remained inside. He could not stay there forever, and when he thought that it was safe to go out, he was confronted by a collier named Mr. Curtis, who disarmed him. He was then arrested and taken to the local public house, where he was guarded for the night. The following Monday, he was taken to jail in the city of Leicester, having been already found guilty of murder by a hastily arranged coroner's court. Despite his crime, the 4th Earl Ferrers was a person of rank, and this meant that he could not be tried in a court in the city of Leicester, as he could only face justice in a court of his peers. 2 weeks later, he was taken to London. He was taken in his own carriage and was accompanied by a strong guard. He was then put before the House of Lords, where on the 14th of February he was committed to the custody of the Black Rod. He was then ordered to be taken and locked up in the Tower. Here he would stay until his trial. During this time he was courteous and polite, and for the most part he behaved as a gentleman and a member of the nobility should. However, sometimes he would open his waistcoat, make strange noises, and use other gestures. The guards believed that this showed that he was somewhat insane. Mrs. Clifford and the three maids had also made the journey to London, but she was not permitted to see the prisoner. On the 16th of April 1760, after spending 2 months and 2 days locked up in the Tower of London, the trial of Laurance Shirley, the 4th Earl Ferrers, began. The fact that he had murdered Mr. Johnson, an appointed trustee of the courts, was never in dispute. The Earl did not try to justify the shooting, even though he firmly believed Mr. Johnson to have been a villain. Instead, he claimed that he shot him because he was insane. If he could prove this to the courts, then he would not be held accountable for his actions. The claim did have merit. After all, his uncle, the 3rd Earl Ferrers, had been removed from office in 1742, as he was considered to be not of sound mind. Many local people believed the 4th Earl to be the same. The Earl conducted his own defence, and did so very well. It was apparent to all that he had a knowledge of the law. Witnesses were presented who confirmed that in their opinion, the defendant, Laurance Shirley, the 4th Earl Ferrers, was insane. One named Mrs. Elizabeth Williams told the court that she had been acquainted with the Earl for many years, and that he had never appeared like any other gentleman she knew. She said that he would look at pictures on the wall and tear them down, shout at people for no reason, and was always musing and talking to himself. Mrs. Williams was the wife of the local publican, and she said that whenever the Earl ordered coffee, she would give him a cup and a coffee pot, but instead of pouring the coffee into the cup, he would instead drink it straight out of the spout. She added that he shouted at everyone and would walk about cursing people. She was then asked if he was sober when doing these things, to which Mrs. Williams replied, "As sober as I am now." She said that the whole town considered him to be a madman. The Earl made a very eloquent speech to his peers. He said, "Witnesses have been called to prove my insanity, to prove an unhappy disorder of mind, and which I am grieved to be under the necessity of showing. However, despite the many local witnesses who informed the court that they believed the Earl not to be of sound mind, his insanity plea was dismissed by the judge. This led the Earl to confess that he had only submitted that defence to oblige his family, and that he had himself always felt somewhat ashamed to do it." At the end of the trial, the peers, having considered the evidence, found the defendant guilty, and Laurance Shirley, the 4th Earl Ferrers, was sentenced to death by hanging. In accordance to an Act of Parliament passed in 1752, known as the Murder Act, the date of the execution was set for Monday the 21st of April. The Act stated that the sentence of death must be delivered immediately following the guilty verdict, thus limiting any opportunity for appeals or bargaining to obtain a more lenient sentence. Immediately means within 2 days of sentencing, except if that would be a Sunday, in which case a sentence was to be carried out the following Monday. The body of the hanged criminal would then be denied a decent burial and be either dissected or publicly hung in giblets and left to rot. Convicted criminals who are awaiting execution were also to be kept in solitary confinement and fed only bread and water, with no visitors except members of the clergy. However, in consideration to the 4th Earl's rank, not all of this applied. His execution date was put back until Monday the 5th of May, so he was able to get his affairs in order. During this time, he made a will. He left £1,300 to Mr. Johnson's children, £1,000 to each of his 4 natural daughters, and £60 a year to Mrs. Clifford for the duration of the rest of her life. His will, however, was not valid, as a condemned man had no right to determine the disposition of his property. On the 5th of May 1760, 39-year-old Laurance Shirley, the 4th Earl Ferrers, was transported from the Tower of London to the scaffold in Tyburn. He was dressed in a light-coloured suit, embroidered with silver, which was the same suit he had worn on his wedding day 8 years earlier. Due to his status, he was allowed to travel to Tyburn in his own carriage. The execution of a person of such noble blood was a very rare occurrence, and a large crowd turned out to witness the event. In fact, the crowd was so large that the carriage took 2 3/4 hours to travel the 4 miles to Tyburn. It was said that during this time, the Earl remained very calm, but had said that he was anxious to have the whole thing over with. Before his execution, he told the sheriff that he had written to the king to ask that he might be executed in the same place as his ancestor, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, as he did not want to die at a place appointed for the execution of common felons. However, His Majesty, King George II, had refused his request. When asked if he had anything to say, the Earl replied, "O God, forgive me all my errors, pardon all my sins." He then told the sheriff where he desired that his body may be buried. Laurance Shirley, the fourth Earl Ferrers, was then hanged. Following the execution, his body was taken to the Barber Surgeons' Hall in Monkswell Street for public exhibition and dissection. 3 days later, on Thursday the 8th of May, the body was released to his friends for interment. The Earl was initially buried in the St Pancras Church. However, in 1782, his body was removed and taken to Staunton Harold Hall, where it was placed in the family vault. Although the Earl's will was deemed to be not valid, it is believed that his requests as to who should be compensated following his death was carried out. Laurance Shirley, the fourth Earl Ferrers, was the last English nobleman and last peer to be executed in Britain. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.